Do you see colours when you hear certain sounds or words? Do certain sounds trigger sensations on your skin or even trigger body movements? Or days of the week have a colour or smell? Or maybe colours or words have a specific taste? Well, you might actually have synesthesia. Hi, I'm Phil, a late diagnosed autistic older adult, and it's my goal to bust myths about autism and provide information to help create a more inclusive world for autistic people. Today, I want to take a bit of a look at something that can occur when our senses overlap, and that is synesthesia. Now, for some context here, the reason I started to look into this topic was because of an experience I had a while ago that I thought might be related, but I'll come back to that a bit later. So firstly, what is synesthesia? Well, you may be aware that autistic people have a different sensory experience to non-autistic people, in that any or all of our sensory systems as autistic people can either be hyposensitive or hypersensitive. But were you aware that this different sensory experience can also mean that in some autistic people, these senses can even overlap and cause one sensory input to be perceived by another sensory system? An example of this might be the experience of tasting sounds or smelling colours. This crossover in senses is called synesthesia and is present in about 4% of the wider population, but is known to be present in up to approximately 20% of autistic people. To reiterate, this is not specific to autism, but seems to be much more common in autistic individuals. The word synesthesia comes from the Greek syn, meaning together, and aesthesis, meaning perception, or quite literally, joined perception. Now, just to be clear, this does not mean a person with synesthesia experiences the wrong senses, for instance, sound instead of smell. But it is that they experience multiple senses simultaneously as a result of a single sensory input. The most common form of this is called bimodal synesthesia, which is where one sense can trigger an accompanying second sense. Some specific examples here might include tactile hearing, where sound might trigger a tactile sensation; tactile vision, where sight might trigger textures or shapes against the skin; tactile gustation, where taste is experienced as a shape; coloured hearing, where a sound triggers a perception of a colour. This is also known as Chromesthesia. Coloured olfaction, where a smell triggers the perception of a colour. Coloured tactility, where touch triggers a colour. Coloured gustation, where taste triggers the perception of a colour. Or audiomotor, where sounds of different words trigger different postures or movements. The second form of synesthesia is multimodal, which is where one sense might trigger several other senses simultaneously. This could be any combination of the above, like hearing a sound triggering seeing a colour and the sensation on the skin at the same time. Synesthesia can also be broken down into another two categories. Sensory synesthesia, which is what is described above, where the overlap is purely sensory, but also cognitive synesthesia, which can also incorporate elements like words, letters, or numbers. An example here is something like the number 5 is always experienced as a specific colour, like yellow for instance. This is also known as grapheme colour synesthesia. Or then there's lexical gustatory synesthesia, where hearing or reading certain words can trigger tastes. Visualising numerical sequences or calendar dates in specific arrangements. This is known as spatial sequence synesthesia. And an extension of this is conceptual synesthesia, where abstract concepts like maths operations or units of time might be perceived as colours. One important point to make here is that each person with synesthesia will have their own individual experience. For instance, people who experience colours won't necessarily experience the same colours as other synesthetes. There are some other general characteristics of synesthesia that would also appear to be common. These are: synesthesia is involuntary, so cannot be either suppressed or invoked by will. Synesthesia is projected into the environment and is not just experienced in the mind. i.e. the person actually sees the colour or hears the sound, rather than just imagining it. Synesthetic perceptions are durable and generic. That is, they are consistent over time and are always experienced with that stimulus. Many synesthetes report the experience as evoking emotions such as pleasure. Synesthetes often have good memory abilities as they have a secondary perception to create that memory with. An example might be when they are introduced to someone, that person's name might invoke a colour or a smell. So later, when thinking of that person, it's not just the name that comes to mind, but the sensory expression of that name. And in fact, many synesthetes report that this sense can be more important when recalling a memory. Synesthesia is often experienced in one direction. For example, sound might influence colours, but colours might not influence sounds. Often, synesthetes have uneven cognitive abilities. They may like order and structure, but have poor math skills, for instance. Synesthesia can be developmental, that is present from birth, acquired from brain injury, stroke, migraine or damage to the optic nerve, and it's also been observed in people who are blindfolded after surgery. It can also be drug-induced from recreational drug hallucinations, or even learned. In experiments, it was shown that a subject could acquire some limited level of synesthesis. When it comes to both synesthesia and autism, both appear to be related to the neural structures in the brain, and more specifically the presence of extraneural connections when compared to the neurotypical brain. These extra connections would appear to create connections between different parts of the brain in the case of synesthesia, compared to a higher amount of extra short-distance connections in the autistic brain. But it is this higher amount of neuron connections in the autistic brain that can also lead to a higher likelihood of synesthetic connections. Like autism, developmental synesthesia is also heritable, which means it runs in families, but it might be that the link might be several generations earlier. Autistic individuals who also have synesthesia may find sensory overwhelm even more intense due to this extrasensory layer. One type of synesthesia, which may relate to autism in particular, is personification synesthesia, which is where the individual may associate personalities to numbers, letters, months, etc. But this may also extend to associating personalities with objects, which is something many autistic people experience. And synesthesia has been reportedly linked with high levels of visual imagery, or hyperphantasia. For some people with synesthesia, there may be a sense of unease or confusion when words or numbers are represented by different colours than they experience. An example of this might be a child with synesthesia going to school and the printed learning material provided by the teacher might have big colourful numbers. The problem being that those colours might not be how the child experiences the specific colours of those numbers because of their synesthesia, and may be confused or even distressed by that difference. So at the top of the podcast, I mentioned that I have had some experiences that may be related here. So the question is, do I have synesthesia? Well, to cut to the chase, I think the answer for me is no, but let me explain. I've had a few experiences, but the main one that really caught my attention was when an unexpected loud noise caused the colour red to rise up in my vision, starting at the bottom until it filled my whole field of view. While this sounds similar to coloured hearing described earlier, the fact that this is not a constantly happening event would lead me to the conclusion that it is not something that would meet the threshold of being actual synesthesia. Added to this is the fact that I've previously had a stroke in the vision part of my brain, so it's more than likely in my case that this acquired brain injury is the root cause of my experience. But if my experiences could be classified as a form of synesthesia, it would probably be something more like transient acquired audio-visual synesthesia. But that's just me making a guess. Having said that, what I also often experience is that certain sounds will trigger some of my tics, which may be consistent with audiomotor synesthesia. But this could also be explained just by the tics alone. So the answer is, I don't think I have synesthesia, but the few experiences I have had have given me a tiny taste of what someone with synesthesia might experience. So in summing up, synesthesia is a condition that, whilst being very rare in the general population, is actually much more common in autistic people. It's not something that is usually described as being unpleasant, and for many people who experience it, it's really just a part of their daily existence. But it may lead to an increased sensory overwhelm in certain situations for some autistic people. One important point to make here also is that synesthesia is not considered to be a disorder or condition requiring treatment, and may in fact increase the person's perception and cognitive abilities. Well, that's it for my diversion into the world of synesthesia. So do you experience synesthesia? Feel free to add your experiences in the comments. And as always, like and subscribe for more lived autistic experiences. Thanks for watching. See you next time.